Members of Council, members of Senate, our Chairperson of Senate, the Principal and Vice Chancellor, Prof Lenkabule, members of the Executive Management and Extended Management, members of the UNISA academic community, colleagues, our students, ladies and gentlemen, molweni, sanibonani, good afternoon, goeiemiddag, dimatekwane. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Professor D.M. Mello, who is a professor at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs here at UNISA. It also gives me great pleasure to also welcome and acknowledge Prof. D.M. Mello's family in attendance today. I do take the opportunity, of course, to acknowledge Prof. Sibusiso Vilnkomo, who is the Executive Dean at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs here at UNISA. More importantly, Professor A.G. Veldhuizen, who is also a professor at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs here at UNISA, who will be the respondent to Prof. Mello's inaugural lecture. I do want to take this opportunity, of course, to welcome the school leadership, Prof. Mello's colleagues, friends present here this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, as I take this opportunity to welcome you all at the University of the Land. Please note, UNISA was founded in 1873 and is the longest existing, dedicated, and the largest distance education institution in the world. We cater for the student population that is equivalent to 1/3 of all South African higher education institutions, and we constitute more than 90% of all students who are enrolled in distance learning programs. Historically, this university is perhaps the only university in South Africa to have provided all people with access to higher education, irrespective of race, color, or creed. But more importantly, on the 26th of June, 2023, we celebrated UNISA's birthday as we turned 150 years old. In these 150 years, we witnessed a major milestone also in 2021 when UNISA appointed its first woman principal and vice chancellor. This is indicative of our efforts to ensure that UNISA continues to be the transformative university in the service of humanity. As a comprehensive, open distance and e-learning institution, we are guided by the principles of lifelong learning, student-centeredness, innovation and creativity. Because of ODEL, we contribute to the knowledge creation, advancement of humankind, and development of a critical citizenry to advance global sustainability. We achieve this through our learner-centered approach, which provides for lifelong learning in a flexible learning environment through interactive learning materials, thereby increasing access into higher education for most disadvantaged students. We also pride ourselves in the development and promotion of our own staff so that they can continue to support our students and communities around us. We are very grateful that this inaugural lecture is taking place within the context of our renewed spirit, in the context of our revised UNISA Strategy 2020-30. As a university, we have embarked on a process and a deliberate effort to focus on 10 niche areas, and these are resource sustainability and energy research, marine and water resource management, natural sciences, governance, management interfaces and reporting systems, automotive, energy, fourth industrial revolution and digitalization, health studies and medicine, feminist, womanist, Bosadi theorization, and of course, student support and co-curricular activities. In some ways, Prof Mello's inaugural lecture has come at the right time. It is the time for the serious consideration of transformation ideals that are consonant with our indigenous knowledge systems within the context of UNISA, our higher education sector, and South Africa as a whole. As a professor, we are relying on you, Prof, and your team to ensure that we take these niche areas to new heights. We are proud that today, UNISA continues to demonstrate the value of a strong cadre of professorship that is necessary to instill in our students critical thinking and analysis of the highest order. This is a very proud moment for every academic as it reflects one of the pinnacles of academic achievement. It gives us great pleasure that our rank of full professors is growing substantially, and we are of the view that such will also grow our research expertise in leaps and bounds in South Africa, our continent, and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of today's proceedings, Prof Vilnkomo will introduce Professor Mello and invite him to the podium. And of course, Prof Veldhuizen will then follow Prof Mello with a response without any further announcements. I now invite Prof Vilnkomo to the podium.
Thank you very much, Prof Ndlovu, for hosting this important inaugural lecture by Dr. Mello. I have the privilege to introduce Dr. David Mello. He is professor in the area of leadership studies and government affairs and acting deputy director for the Research and Innovation Hub at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at our distinguished University of South Africa. His academic career started at Vista University after working for the Public Service Commission and the Department of Public Service and Administration. From Vista University, he then joined Technikon Northwest, which became Tshwane University of Technology, where he was lecturer, associate professor, and head of Department of Public Management. Professor Mello served the Northwest University as professor, head of the Department of Public Administration, and research director in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the Mafeking campus. Professor Mello is a member of the editorial committee of the South African Association of Public Administration and Management. He is a reviewer of a variety of accredited journals. He is an external examiner for several universities, and his interests are in public human capital management, performance monitoring, and the evaluation, as well as public sector ethics. He has published articles in accredited journals and conference proceedings, and has read papers at national and international conferences and authored chapters in books. Professor Mello has supervised and examined master's and doctoral students from different universities. He is a C-rated academic by the National Research Foundation and the editor of a book titled Ethics in the Public Sector published by Van Skyke in 2020. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and I would like to start by acknowledging the presence of very important people in this lecture. The first one would be Professor Pulenleng Kabula in her absentia as the principal of this university. I also want to acknowledge Professor S.K. Ndlovu, who is the Vice Principal for Strategy, Risk, Advisory Services at UNISA. And the third person I want to acknowledge is the presence of my immediate leader, Professor Vel Nkomo, who is the Executive Dean of the African School of Public and International Affairs, and that is where I am grounded as a researcher. I would also like to acknowledge the presence and, most importantly, the willingness of Professor Veldhuizen in terms of agreeing to be the respondent to this lecture. Now, my lecture is going to be about the divergence as well as the convergence of performance management, monitoring, and evaluation in South Africa. And my focus is particularly in the public sector, because I'm in the focus area of government studies within the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. And I would like to again thank the university for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts and to share my ideas and research in as far as the area of performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation. Now, what I'm going to share with you is basically a culmination of research that I've been conducting over a period of time. And in this research, particularly in the area of performance management, I have noticed that advanced countries, those countries that are said to be the first world countries, are advanced for a reason, because they have invested sufficiently in as far as the development of systems around performance management as well as the monitoring and evaluation. One country that I actually had looked at in the past was a small country called Singapore, which in terms of comparison to South Africa, I would say they're doing excellent in terms of their systems of performance management as well as the monitoring and evaluation. But my focus would be here at home in South Africa. And in fact, my argument is that in as far as the research that has been done in the two areas, that is performance management on the one hand, as well as monitoring and evaluation on the other hand, I have realized that as researchers, we have built some kind of a wall between these areas. And my main question, which is the preoccupation of this paper, is whether it is necessary for these two areas of interest to me and a lot of other researchers, whether it is necessary for these two areas to be separated by this wall. And by the end of my lecture, I should be able to answer this question to say, yes, it is necessary, or rather, alternatively, it is not necessary to have this artificial wall existing between performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation in the South African public sector. Now, in terms of how my paper is structured, I'll first look at the concepts, and in particular, not necessarily going to each one of the concepts and its definition, but the flow in terms of what are the concepts, the definitions by different scholars telling us in terms of the separation between the two areas that I am focusing on. I'll also look at the micro as well as the macro perspective in as far as performance management is concerned. And then I will also look into the evolution as well as the nexus between performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation, again within the context of South Africa. And the interesting part I'll also look at is the locus as well as the focus of the two areas. Because when I looked at the locus as well as the focus, you'd also be able to see perhaps the overlaps between these areas, and perhaps as a person looking at this lecture, you would be able to say, yes, I agree with you, or perhaps to say, yes, or no, I disagree with you in terms of the way you're articulating these two areas. Now, and I also look at the area which I call leapfrogging performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation into the artificial intelligence era. And then finally, I'll do the conclusion in as far as the paper is concerned. Now, when I looked at the concepts that have actually been put out there, and I'm also including the concept that I have coined as a researcher in the past, because I am the author of a book titled, or rather the editor of the book titled Managing Human Capital in the Public Sector. And within that book, I have a chapter on performance management. And in that chapter, I'm also one of those people who are talking about the definition of concepts and who are charting the way in terms of where we're going in as far as the understanding of performance management is concerned. And in my definition, I'm actually looking at performance management as a process that is integrated within other processes as well as the systems within an organization. It is a process that, and I argue, that is aimed at making sure that the organization achieve its own predetermined objectives. Now, it is also a process that is focusing on the development of individuals. Now, when I look at the other definitions of very prominent authors, very prominent scholars, and these prominent scholars are, among others, Armstrong, who have published a number of articles and books in as far as performance management is concerned. I've looked at Pulakos as one of those authors who have also published in terms of the area of performance management. Now, what I do find in terms of the definitions is that we do have an agreement in terms of what performance management entails, because we all agree that it is a process. The only perhaps slight difference would be where perhaps I'm talking about an individual, but one author is actually saying that it is more about the individual as well as the team in as far as the context of an organization is concerned. Now, I spoke about Armstrong, who is actually emphasizing the need or the importance of feedback as well as reinforcement of the behavior as well as the presence of a dialogue within the process and as well as the sub-processes of performance management. Now, we also have an agreement among authors that performance management also needed to align the individual objectives as well as organizational objectives. Because if there is misalignment, then you find that an individual is no longer working towards the achievement of the predetermined objectives of the organization. Now, when you turn your focus and then you look at the concept of monitoring as well as evaluation, when you look at these two concepts, we actually take them apart, although they are referring to one area of interest in terms of research. But we take them apart to look at first what we mean by monitoring. And in terms of monitoring, there is some kind of consensus that monitoring is more of a continuous activity that is more about the collection of evidence, the collection of data in as far as a particular process, in as far as a particular project, and also the existence of a program within which we have to collect data. Now, when you look at this explanation in as far as monitoring is concerned, you then realize that in order for performance management to be rolled out effectively, there must also be collection of some kind of evidence that a supervisor or a manager has to make a decision on. And therefore, already you see that in as far as the concept of monitoring is concerned, there's already an overlap in terms of just the first part of the definition as far as what monitoring is all about. Now, when you look, and there is also consensus among different authors, different scholars in as far as what monitoring entails. Now, in addition to that, we also have the aspect of the quantitative aspect of monitoring as well as the qualitative aspect of monitoring in as far as projects and programs are concerned, where you're collecting raw data in terms of the number of, for instance, RDP houses that are being built in a particular province. You're looking at the qualitative aspect, but you may also look into the qualitative aspect. And the qualitative aspect would talk to what has been put in terms of the building of that particular house. Now, when you look at the other part of this concept of monitoring evaluation, which is evaluation, you then realize that for you to do the evaluation, you then are going to rely on the data that has been collected. Now, in terms of evaluation, we are basically talking about a process through which you are going to assess. Now, that implies that you are going to do some kind of value judgment in terms of the project that is being implemented, the program that is being implemented. Now, when you look at evaluation, you would realize that it is an area that would require that for it to be performed at its utmost best, you may need to put in place a number of scientific methods as well as tools to ensure that data that is being collected is then going to be analyzed in following some scientific methods as well as procedures. Now, when you look at evaluation, there are actually differences in terms of ideas among scholars as to when is evaluation coming into the picture. There is one view that says that allow the project to run. At the end of the project, you then do the evaluation. There is another view that says that when you look at evaluation, you should actually start with the design. Is the design of this particular project or program good enough? And then you should also look at the implementation of the project. And then you are also going to do evaluation at the end. Meaning that when you look at this other view in terms of explaining what evaluation is all about, you realize that the second view basically holds much water, in the sense that it is saying that evaluation, if it happens right at the end of a project, how do you know that there were mistakes throughout? What if money has been wasted? Now, if you have the design and you have the implementation evaluation, then you would be able to you would be able to see the red flags as they go up during the implementation of your project, or rather the program. Now, when you look at evaluation, or rather the so-called the evaluation studies, you then realize that the evaluation studies would focus more on the output as well as the outcomes of that particular project. The outputs can be tangible, but in as far as the outcome and the impact, it implies that you are no longer looking at the immediate quantitative and qualitative aspect, but you are looking at the ripple effect in as far as that particular project is concerned. If you build people an RDP house, now after a few years, or rather at the end of the handing over, you can go back to these people and say, how do you feel now that you have a house? Perhaps somebody would say that, I feel that now I own something. I feel that now I have a property that I can use in as far as getting money for a small business. So it is no longer about the immediate outputs in as far as the project, but you're looking at the broader picture. And that is the essence in as far as monitoring and evaluation is concerned. Now, when I look at these two areas, which is performance management, monitoring and evaluation, I then realize that, again, when you evaluate an individual, you are also going to collect data. You're also going to do an assessment. The only difference is that you're basing it on an individual. But I'm also arguing on the other side that when you do monitoring and evaluation, you're not going to evaluate systems. You're going to evaluate projects and programs. Within those projects and programs, you have individuals that are performing specific functions in order to make sure that the project as well as the programs are actually succeeding in terms of their rollout. And I'm going to come back to this area when I look at the focus as well as the locus, because then I'll be looking at the similarities as well as the differences in terms of monitoring and evaluation is concerned. Now, at this stage, I'll turn my attention to the macro as well as the micro levels of performance management in the public sector. Now, when you look at perhaps let me start with the macro perspective of performance management. And I'm going to take maybe a much more broader picture, look at the bigger picture of the global world, South Africa, until the lower level of a department. And the argument that I'm making is that in order for us to talk about, for instance, a developmental state, a state that is satisfying the needs of members of the public, we have to look at the macro perspective in terms of performance. And I'm arguing that the macro perspective of performance of a country is more about institutions within a country, but most importantly, it is also about institutions that are out there, outside the country. And I mentioned the word a global world or a globalized world, because in that sense, it means that what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening in America, is having an impact in one way or the other in terms of the performance of the Republic of South Africa as a country. And therefore implies that when you look at the macro perspective, you have to start with the global village that we find ourselves in. But when you drill down and you come to South Africa, you'd say that the highest institution that we have in the country is actually Parliament. And Parliament is responsible for making laws. But Parliament is a result of political processes that are taking place in South Africa. Parliament is a result of elections which came into being as a result of different parties contesting, and each one of them having a manifesto. Now, that manifesto for the winning party, it is now going to be translated into a government policy. And that is where Parliament becomes very critical in as far as the overall performance of the country in terms of its development, or rather the satisfaction of the needs of members of the public in South Africa. Now, Parliament, with its role in terms of making laws, it also have got a crucial role of having to elect the president. Now, that is where an area of performance at a macro perspective of the country also comes into the picture. The president is elected and then go ahead and forms his or her own cabinet. Now, after being elected, Parliament doesn't abdicate its own responsibility of holding the president to account. By virtue of the powers that are vested in Parliament in terms of the election of the president, the same Parliament has got the power to pass a motion of no confidence. And I'm sure in South Africa we've seen images of Parliament having to pass a motion of no confidence from time to time by smaller parties. And for these smaller parties, it didn't make any sense. But politics being politics, they needed to prove a point. But if a motion of no confidence is passed by the majority party in this current state being the ANC, it means that it has got a chance of succeeding. Now, it means that a president, once he or she is elected into office, would then have to give an explanation in terms of the success and failures of governing role in as far as the state is concerned. And that is why the president is given the opportunity to appoint a number of ministers that at any given time he can dismiss them, he can reshuffle cabinet. And again, you'll also realize in South Africa, the president is actually accountable to basically two sets of masters. And the first master I've also already mentioned is the Parliament. The second master that the president is accountable to is the political party, because the political party also has to hold the president to account. And it has got the power as well to say that if president, you're not doing what we want you to do, we can simply recall you. And I'm sure it has happened in South Africa in the past. Now, when you look at this broader picture of performance, the macro perspective of performance in South Africa, you then realize that the president and the ministers are jointly accountable for the running of the state in the form of a state department. And that is where the actual performance at a global, or rather at a macro perspective, is happening. The supervision of all government departments to make sure that they deliver in terms of the mandates that were given, in terms of the legislation in South Africa. Now, when you look at this macro picture of the performance of the state, when you look at the level of a government department, you realize that a government department is led by a director general or the accounting officer of that particular department, who is also accountable to the minister and being appointed because of his or her ability to bring together politics and administration in as far as the running of a government department. And it is for this reason that each one of the government departments would have a vision as well as mission, because those visions as well as missions are saying, where are we going in terms of the future? And that is why the evaluation, the performance assessment of government departments is actually something that should be done from outside a department, and again should also be done internally within the departments. Now, apart from this macro perspective of performance that I've just given, we also have what I'm referring to as the micro perspective. Now, when you look at the micro perspective of performance within government, you then realize that we're actually drilling down to the individuals as well as the teams. And that is where the actual performance management, as outlined by a number of scholars, is happening. Because in this instance, you have individuals that have to perform a number of functions as well as duties. But in addition to that, they are also belonging to a number of teams, or rather they are belonging to directorates. And therefore it implies that when you look at performance management at the level of a department, we have to clearly understand the role of the individual in relation to the team, or rather the directorate that he is performing the functions within. Now, with regard to the individual, you realize that the monitoring of performance and the evaluation of that particular performance is going to be done internally. Whereas in terms of the overall organization, we can have the monitoring and evaluation that is being done from outside that particular organization. Now, beyond the individual who must constantly be evaluated, one would also realize that we have the so-called monitoring and evaluation organization, or some of whom they are calling themselves the evaluation organization. And I'm asking a question, very simple question, in terms of perhaps the titles that you're using. If you say you are an evaluation organization, what are you evaluating? And I'm actually saying that using the concept of evaluation organization without having to include performance is actually a misnomer, because every evaluation that we have to do, every performance that has to be assessed, whether at a macro perspective or at a micro perspective, it is going to be the evaluation of performance in terms of the outputs of the organization or the outputs of the individual within that particular organization. I'll further turn my attention to the evolution as well as the nexus between monitoring and evaluation and performance management. Now, when you look at the evolution of, perhaps let me start with performance management. When you look at its evolution, you then realize that in terms of scholarship that is available out there, we are unable to pin it down to a particular point in the evolution of humankind. And I therefore argue that if you have to trace the evolution of performance management, you actually have to trace the evolution of humankind. And when you trace the evolution of humankind, you then realize that historically, even before our time, during the time of the hunter-gatherers in Africa, for instance, for some reason, they had to work together in order to achieve an objective. They had to work together in order to hunt and catch an animal that is going to be used for food. And therefore implies that I'm actually tracing performance management from that particular era, from that particular point in time, when two or more people had to work together. And in fact, one very prominent scholar who is no more in the field of government studies or public administration, who was Professor Klute, he actually said that administration, any kind of administration, comes together when two or more people cooperate in order to achieve one predetermined objective. And that I found very instructive in terms of tracing the origin of performance management. Now, to further trace the origin as well as the evolution and the nexus between performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation, I actually go back in history and look at some of the very critical theories that have influenced public administration, government studies, have influenced human resource management, which is also an area that I've got an interest in. Now, when you go back into these theories, and I'm actually looking at these two theories, the theory of Frederick Taylor, as well as the theory of Max Weber. Now, perhaps let me start with the theory of Frederick Taylor, and you see how what happened in the past is actually repeating itself in terms of some of the ideas that were put forth by theorists such as Frederick Taylor. Because Frederick Taylor was actually somebody who is concerned about how organizations are functioning. But he had his own philosophy. And his philosophy was that when you actually improve performance of individual employees in an organization, you are actually improving productivity. And by implication, when you improve productivity, it means that you have more outputs. When you have more outputs, you can sell at a lower price. And therefore, members of the public are going to benefit. And therefore, his argument was that his theory is actually about fighting poverty. Now, in addition to that, he was also of the belief that when you increase performance, and remember he was talking from the perspective of the private sector, and I'll bring that into context in as far as the public sector is concerned as well. And he was saying that the owners of the companies or the shareholders, when productivity goes up, performance is improved, they are also going to benefit, because more output means more money for them. And he had this idea that the more money you make as the employer, the more money you are also likely to give to your employees. And in fact, when you look at the current performance management systems in South Africa, both in the private sector and the public sector, you'd realize that his ideas actually had a tremendous impact in as far as the current implementation and the configuration of performance management systems in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. Now, Frederick Taylor was also of the view that you can actually use a stopwatch to measure the performance of an individual. So therefore, you're looking at the outputs as well as the quantities within a specific amount of time. And he was talking about a fair day's work. And he was saying that those employees who are performing better are actually going to receive incentives. In the public sector, in the private sector, within universities, we use the system of incentives. And therefore, we are saying that we are dangling a carrot in front of the eyes of the employees. And that is why what Frederick Taylor suggested. And when you look at the negotiations in South Africa between employer as well as employees, it always revolves around the same issues, whether there is enough money in order to pay employees. Now, better performance within the public sector basically implies that we would be able to deliver more and better services. It basically implies that we would be able to deliver services of a much higher quality to members of the public. And that is why performance management becomes very important in as far as our public sector institutions are concerned. Now, historically, and I'm now coming back to the issue of monitoring and evaluation. Now, performance management, I'm tracing it back to the individual humankind evolution when they had to work together in order to either build houses or hunt. Now, when you look at monitoring and evaluation, you would realize that in the 1980s, for instance, we didn't have the concept of monitoring and evaluation in the public sector. And now, this is the period before the 90s. This is the period I'm calling the period of convergence, where you didn't have the separation between these two areas. But beyond 1990, that is where we started having the separation between performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation. And perhaps of interest is, how was performance monitored then, if we didn't have monitoring and evaluation? Now, the answer actually lies in the theory of Max Weber. Because Max Weber was also a sociologist, but a sociologist who had impact in as far as the public sector is concerned, the study of government is concerned. Because he believed in the establishment of institutions that have got a hierarchy. Now, the hierarchy, that's where performance occurred. The hierarchy, that is where monitoring and evaluation occurred, although it was not called monitoring and evaluation. Now, in as far as Max Weber is concerned, apart from his preoccupation with the idea of having a hierarchy, he was saying an organization must be rule-bound. He was saying an organization must employ people because of competence. And when we assess employees, when we interview employees, what we're actually looking at, even today, is the competence of an individual. But he also spoke about centralized control. Now, perhaps some of the aspects that he mentioned in terms of his theory brought him a lot of criticism, particularly the hierarchy, particularly an organization that is rule-bound. And that is why the concept of bureaucracy came into the picture, the concept of red tape. But if you look at his original intention, there was no intention on his part to bring about an organization that is going to be slow, an organization that is going to have a lot of processes and procedures that are impacting on the turnaround in terms of service delivery to members of the public. What he envisaged was a structure that would be able to function. But most importantly, a structure that would be able to ensure that performance is being looked after and objectives are ultimately being achieved. Now, turning my attention to what has happened in the post-1990. The post-1990, and I'm calling this era the era of divergence. Now, I'm calling it the era of divergence because subsequently, what we call monitoring and evaluation was born. And when you look at monitoring and evaluation and how it was born, it is actually linked to the emergence of what is known as the new public management. And the new public management was basically premised on the fact that you have to look at what is happening in the private sector. And you have to adopt some of the principles that are there in the private sector, bring them into the public sector. Having done that, you should also be able to implement them accordingly and successfully to ensure that you can have a result-based government. Now, you realize that as times go on in as far as the evolution of government and mankind, populations are increasing. And as populations are increasing, the type of the needs of members of the public are also changing. So in the 90s, we started having pressure on government in terms of delivery. Deliver more out of limited resources. And that is where monitoring and evaluation came into the picture. Now in Africa, for instance, we had scholars such as Basheka, as well as Biamugisha, who actually attempted to trace the evolution of monitoring and evaluation within the African perspective. And they are also believing that monitoring and evaluation in Africa, and by implication in South Africa, is still at an infancy stage. And I can confirm that as well, that in terms of looking at the literature and the evolution of this new baby or this infant, you don't find a lot in terms of what has happened, in terms of publications. Now, when we look at Africa and South Africa, we had the establishment of a number of organizations. Within the context of Africa, we had evaluation organization at an African level, as well as the establishment of a journal, which meant that we were then gravitating towards the establishment of an academic discipline. We also started having a number of institutions, and UNISA is one of those that are offering courses in monitoring and evaluation. And some have even taken it up to the level of a PhD. Now, it means that within a short period of time, this infant called monitoring and evaluation was able to get a lot of support and to evolve much more quickly. And among the institutions that were also at the center of the establishment of monitoring and evaluation, one would realize that we had the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. Well, they didn't have a choice. They had to be at the forefront of making sure that this area or discipline is becoming fully fleshed. We had the Public Service Commission. We have organizations such as CLEAR, which also came into the picture and make sure that we have a fully fleshed discipline. And I must say that it is a discipline that is still evolving over a period of time. Now, what we also had in practice within government departments, we had the establishment of units that are called monitoring and evaluation units. Now, these units were established at a time when we have not as yet established exactly what is the locus and focus of monitoring and evaluation. And at first, they were actually staffed by people who did not have the training in as far as monitoring and evaluation. Of late, we have people who have been trained. But in terms of the positioning within the structure of most government departments, it was still not clear. In terms of their role was also not clearly defined. And the consequence of that was that ultimately you had conflicts between line function units as well as units that were established for purposes of monitoring and evaluation. And it would be my suggestion at the end of this paper that some of those conflicts and actually the separation can be dealt with. And I will now turn my focus to the locus as well as the focus of monitoring and evaluation as well as performance. And in this instance, I'm going to look at the similarities as well as the differences. Again, looking at it from the perspective of the South African public service. Now, within the public service, apart from the establishment of units, when you look at performance management as well as monitoring, you realize that performance management in terms of the policy driver, you have the Department of Public Service and Administration. Whereas on the other side, when you look at monitoring and evaluation, you have the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. Now, in terms of the Department of Public Service and Administration, you realize that it is performing its functions and duties in terms of the Public Service Act of 1994 as amended. But when you look at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, you realize that it is actually not performing its functions in terms of a particular act, but it is performing its functions in terms of cabinet-approved policy framework. And the two are actually looking at different areas. DPSA looking at performance management as a policy driver, DPME looking at the monitoring and evaluation within the context of the entire public service. Now, when you look at the nature of performance management, you realize that performance management is looking at the micro perspective of the organization. It looks at an individual, and at best, it will look at the performance of teams. Now, when you look at monitoring and evaluation, you realize that it's much more broader. It looks into the entire organization. Hence, I spoke about earlier the external evaluation of an organization. Now, performance management and measurement is actually ongoing. And that is why supervisor from time to time would want to know what employees are doing. Whereas when you look at monitoring and evaluation, only the one part is ongoing, which is the monitoring. But the evaluation seems to be periodic. It is not ongoing as such. Now, when you look at performance management, you realize that it is generic, because you are trying to look at the performance of an employee holistically, the good as well as the bad in the performance of this particular individual. But when you look at program and project evaluation, you realize that it is much more specific. Remember, I spoke about design evaluation, I spoke about implementation evaluation, and I spoke about evaluation right at the end, which means that that is where the aspect of being specific come into the picture. Performance management, by its nature, is routine. Whereas when you look at evaluation in particular, one would realize that it has to be customized. The same tools that I am using to evaluate the implementation of low-cost housing cannot be used in order to look at interventions that are meant to alleviate poverty in South Africa. And that is where you find the differences in terms of the utilization of the tools, because your tools have to be customized to a particular project, or rather a particular program that you are dealing with. Now, when you look at performance management, again, you also realize that performance management, when you talk about resources, they are part and parcel of the infrastructure of monitoring and evaluation, or rather of the assessment of performance of an individual or rather a team. But on the other hand, when you look at monitoring and evaluation, you realize that monitoring and evaluation makes resources the target, because it wants to find out whether we have been effective as well as efficient in terms of the implementation of the project. Were we efficient? Did we save some money? Did we benefit from the economies of scale in as far as the public sector is concerned? But when you look at the two areas of interest in terms of my paper, then you realize that they are basically specific areas that makes them common. Because ultimately, whether you are assessing from the perspective of performance management, or you are assessing from the perspective of monitoring and evaluation, you are in the end going to be looking at the outputs. You are going to be looking at whether you have been able to utilize less inputs in order to get more outputs. So it means this looking at the outputs and the inputs cut across both performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation. An element of planning must go into both the areas, these two areas of interest. In performance management as well as in monitoring and evaluation, you are also going to do some kind of measurement. You are also going to do some kind of a review in terms of perhaps a quarterly performance, or rather a 6-monthly performance in as far as either an individual or rather a project is concerned. Now, you also want to bring in an element of continuous improvement, so that the project that you implement this year should actually be better next year if you are replicating it elsewhere. So therefore, you realize that there is an element of learning on the part of both of them in in performance management, you want a person who is underperforming to learn new skills, to improve. In terms of projects, again, you want more success. In both of them, you're also looking at communication. For you to be successful, you must communicate at all times. And through communication, you are actually by other means giving feedback in as far as the individuals are concerned. And therefore, one would realize that you are basically looking at two parallel areas of study that have got commonalities in terms of their implementation is concerned. Now, the area that is very interesting is basically the area of the locus as well as the focus. The locus is where in the organization do we put performance management? Where in the organization do we put monitoring and evaluation? Now, with performance management, perhaps it's more simplistic in the sense that performance management belongs to human resources, but its operationalization belongs to line function managers. Now, it is the line function managers who has to make sure that they apply policies that are coming from the human resource division, and by implication, the human resource division having to do the monitoring in terms of the rollout. Now, in terms of the focus, performance management, by and large, focuses on the individual, and to a larger extent, in some instances as well, on teams to which these individuals are belonging. Now, what is actually interesting when I look at this divergence that started in the 1990s is that when you look at the organograms of a number of government departments, that's when you then see the confusion as well as the locus of monitoring and evaluation. Now, when you look at some of the central government departments, as for instance, the National Treasury, you realize that the National Treasury would have a number of monitoring units. Now, this monitoring unit, for instance, I'll mention the unit that is called Supply Chain Management, Governance and Monitoring, as well as Compliance, which is based in the Office of the Chief of Procurement within the National Treasury. And then you also have a unit called Governance, Monitoring, as well as Compliance. That is also within Treasury. And then you have Strategic Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. It is also a unit that is embedded within the National Treasury. Now, you see the same pattern when you go to the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, because it is also having a number of units that are looking at monitoring and evaluation. And among those units in the DPME, you have sector planning and monitoring. You have public sector monitoring and capacity development. And the last unit that you have there is frontline and citizen-based service delivery monitoring. Now, when you turn your attention away from these centralized institutions, which is the Treasury, as well as the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and you go to other line function department, and by line function department, I'm referring to those departments that are responsible for a particular function, such as health, such as social development, such as infrastructure in the case of the Department of Public Works, as well as agriculture. Now, there you begin to see perhaps the confusion in terms of the locus of monitoring as well as evaluation. Because you are likely to find monitoring and evaluation situated in the office of the Chief information officer. In other institutions, you'll find that monitoring and evaluation is in the unit that is responsible for planning of the department, which implies that there is no consistency in terms of the locus of monitoring and evaluation. And therefore, that is where my point comes in terms of making sure that we can be able to decide as to where should it be located in as far as government departments are concerned. Having mentioned some of the problems when we started initiating monitoring and evaluation in government departments, my view and my assertion in terms of this whole picture of monitoring and evaluation, in particular its locus, is that it should be treated more like an internal audit. Because you want a monitor, you want a person who is evaluating, who is going to be independent from other people who cannot be influenced. You want these people to not to be influenced by even the top management, so that the assessments can be as effective as possible. The feedback that they give can be to the advantage of our organizations. Now, having made that point in terms of where monitoring and evaluation should be, the focus is actually very simple, because it is about what are we focusing on, which are projects, programs, and the overall performance of the department. Perhaps the last area before I conclude would be the area where I talk about leapfrogging performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation into the era of artificial intelligence. Now, this is the area where I believe that we can be able to bring about convergence. Remember, we had convergence until the early 1990s, and then we had a divergence. And I'm arguing in my paper that through technology, we can somehow be able to bring convergence between performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation. Now, most organizations, it is argued by some of eminent scholars that in the past 15 to 20 years, most organizations have started gravitating towards the improvement of their systems to make sure that there is digital transformation. Now, that digital transformation means that most of organizations have started introducing web-based performance management, meaning that they started ensuring that they move away from the manual way of having to collect data, the manual way of having to process data, and the manual way of having to perhaps give feedback to employees. Now, what artificial intelligence is saying that is that you actually have to bring together computers, mathematics, the softwares, the hardwares, the statistics in order to improve a number of areas of human endeavor. But my focus in this instance is the improvement of performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation. And there are scholars who actually argue that, in fact, if you have the right infrastructure, the right systems, the right software, some of the functions that are performed by individuals, such as the shortlisting of candidates, can actually be done by computers. And it implies that the entire value chain, in as far as onboarding an employee until the exit of an employee, can actually be assisted by artificial intelligence. But when you talk about the artificial intelligence, you bring a shivers to a lot of people. Because people are now believing that, oh, now computers, because computers are becoming more cleverer, they can think like I do, they are then going to take some of the jobs that we are having. But in fact, the idea, in as far as leapfrogging artificial intelligence, is basically about making sure that an individual or organizations are actually being assisted in terms of some of the manual roles and responsibilities that are taking place within the organization. And my point also again comes into the picture in as far as the artificial intelligence, that when you have a very sound infrastructure, you can actually integrate performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation, use the same dashboard in order to collect data, in order to analyze that particular data, and ultimately to give feedback to employees, and by the same token, be able to give feedback to the project leaders. Now, I'm arguing as well that when you go into the era of artificial intelligence, some of the problems that we are having in as far as performance management is concerned, problems relating to biasness, favoritism, can be something of the past. But again, you also have a number of prerequisites that you have to tick before you can say, yes, I am now firmly in the area of artificial intelligence. And that would imply that you need to have an infrastructure, computer infrastructure, that is reliable. You need to have people who are trained. You need to have a system that is simplistic. You need to have a system that will bring about accuracy. But most importantly, for artificial intelligence to be able to work, it implies that we have to feed these systems with more and more accurate data so that it can be able to process it on our behalf. And ultimately implies that you still need a human being to be able to do inputs. But most importantly, if you have smart dashboards, as an employee is performing his work on a laptop, artificial intelligence can collect the data in terms of the performance of that particular individual. By the end of the week, we can have a report to say, so and so employee X has been able to have X amount of outputs. And therefore, we will have a performance management system that is not going to be disputed. And hence, I'm arguing for the integration of the monitoring and evaluation using dashboards, using artificial intelligence to ensure that ultimately we have a seamless system. And in conclusion, I'm actually arguing that the thin line, the thin wall that I spoke about when I started with this lecture is actually not necessary. And it is with the help of sophisticated computer infrastructure, the software and artificial intelligence, that we can be able to weave together performance management as well as monitoring and evaluation. I thank you.
Prof Mello, thank you for observing all protocols. Also, thank you for your inaugural lecture on divergence and convergence of performance management, monitoring and evaluation in South Africa. Professor, I found your presentation to be very informative and thought-provoking. It is for me an exceptional honor to respond to the lecture. Professor Mello joined the Tom Mbeki African School for Public and International Affairs at the beginning of 2022 as a full professor with a C3 rating from the National Research Foundation. During this time, he has demonstrated advanced knowledge and insight into governance affairs and his niche area of monitoring and evaluation of performance. It was clear to us that his deep and broad understanding of the subject comes from his advanced studies and many years of practice in the field. He has walked the road to academic excellence beyond just studying governance from a distance. Departing from the central thesis that performance management has been inadvertently and deliberately been separated from monitoring and evaluation, he made a number of interesting points. Firstly, getting to the root of this separation, which he calls divergence, he looks at a number of definitions to detect any evidence of separation and similarities which may be discernible. I was particularly interested in your discussion where you refer to typical organograms of government departments to drive a point about the locus and focus of divergence, and case studies from the real world of a governance department to explain the confusion and dangers caused by the locus and focus of the divergent streams. I furthermore found of significance your reminder that performance should not only be assessed in terms of tangible outputs, but also the less tangible ripple effects on society. Prof. David Mello further goes on an academic journey to contextualize performance management from macro and micro perspectives, starting with Parliament, the executive up to the level of a department and the unit of a department in the government. His important reminder of closer collaboration between line and support functions, auditing independent from top management, and an emphasis on organizational performance is noted. In his paper, Prof Mello traces the evolution and nexus between performance management and monitoring and evaluation. He makes an inference that performance management could be as old as human activity, while monitoring and evaluation are of recent origin. He uses Max Weber and Frederick Taylor's theory to demonstrate how far back performance management goes in relation to monitoring and evaluation. The locus and focus of performance management and monitoring and evaluation do not escape scrutiny in his paper. In explaining the locus, Professor Mello answers where the two areas should be located and what they should be concerned with. Lastly, Prof Mello's paper focuses on what he calls leapfrogging performance management and monitoring and evaluation in the area of artificial intelligence, which he professes provides an answer to bringing about convergence between sophisticated performance management and monitoring and evaluation, where machine learning and the human mind comes together. Recently, I had the pleasure of participating in and chairing a session in which he and a number of practitioners were establishing a community of practice to explore and maximize the use of technology tools in a networked world we are living in. The community of practice is an initiative where several scholars and practitioners like him can join their metaphorically calloused hands to commit their intellectual competence in finding innovative solutions to build governance institutions and management practices beyond just administration that can serve the citizens who gave them the mandate to do so. Your emphasis on the eradication of poverty through performance management to improve service delivery is of urgent contemporary importance. From the lecture emerges an essential question that scholars can take forward. It will be essential for us to learn from you and other scholars in your field how you apply innovative transdisciplinary methodologies to discover new knowledge at the intersection between public governance, education, and artificial intelligence. A question you may like to explore, if you have not already done so, is how popular paradigms such as the theories of Taylor and Weber that you mentioned, artificial intelligence theory, sustainable peace theory, Bloom's taxonomy, Maslow's hierarchy, and others can be replaced by a theoretical perspective and practice that reflects African knowledge systems and benefits an African rising in practice in terms of the functioning of structures, work ethics, and other practices. Thank you once again for your lecture, Prof Mello. I look forward to your leadership in research and innovation and your subsequent publications that will add to an already remarkable body of knowledge from your exceptional mind. Thank you.
Members of Council, members of Senate, Madam Principal and Vice Chancellor, members of academic community, students, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University Council, our Senate, and the leadership, please join me in officially welcoming Professor David Mbati Mello to the ranks of full professors at the University of South Africa. Prof Mello, thank you for the complex, instructive, and a very provocative lecture. It does come at an opportune time as we are engaging ourselves in curricular deliberations and transformation. We as a university, UNISA, pride ourselves as the African university shaping futures in the service of humanity. We are very pleased to have you amongst UNISA's professors, and on behalf of the Council, the Senate, and the university management, I congratulate you on having achieved this academic milestone. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this afternoon's proceedings. Considering that we are doing this lecture online, I am sure you have planned for the celebrations of this day wherever you are. Please be safe and take care. Thank you.